The University of Alberta is situated on Treaty 6 territory, which is the traditional lands of the First Nations and Métis people. And while it's now really customary, it's customary on our websites, it's customary in our talks, to acknowledge the historical injustices of the settler colonial state within the hallowed halls of our university spaces, it's especially crucial to my mind in the context of a talk such as this one. I say this because to offer a talk on the intersection of art and ecological justice necessitates acknowledging the role of the settler colonial, patriarchal, and petro-capitalist state in giving us the world that we now live in. That is a world that is of unequal and increasing climate catastrophe. The worldview that underpins that framework is fundamentally unecological. It's unecological because it treats its lands, its creatures, and indeed the vast majority of humans on the planet as resources to be managed in the project of capital accumulation. And this is a perspective that is central to the talk that we're going to listen to tonight. Right? Tom Rice, his talk is concerned with the environment. It's concerned with fossil fuel dependence and with the growing global crisis that is linked to climate change. Tonight he's going to discuss this, and he's going to discuss how he, over the last 5 years, through his drawing and installation work, became interested in these topics, why they matter to him, and why he explores them through his artwork. Tom is the Joanne and Robert Stewart Professor of Art at Kalamazoo College. He's a multimedia artist working in drawing and painting and video and performance art. He received a BFA from Tyler, the Tyler School of Art, and an MFA from the University of Georgia. And he received residency fellowships from the Virginia Center for the Creative Arts, Oxbow, and the Ragdale Foundation. In 2002, Tom received Kalamazoo College's Lucas Fellowship for excellence in scholarship. And his work has been exhibited at universities and galleries, museums internationally. We are thrilled to have him here tonight. And indeed, we're thrilled to have him here all semester as the visiting artist and Fulbright Canada Scholar in the Department of Art and Design and affiliated with the department's Research, Creation, and Social Justice Collaboratory. So thank you for being here. Thank you for sharing your work with us, for meeting with our students, meeting in our classes, researching and thinking with us about such important topics. Thank you, and please join me in welcoming Tom Rice.
Okay, can you hear me? Wow. Is that loud? It sounds loud to me. Okay.
It's not loud.
All right. First, I would like to thank Natalie for that lovely introduction, and I'd like to thank the University of Alberta Department of Art and Design for giving me this opportunity to be here. And Natalie and Sean Caulfield had done an awful lot to get me, or help me get here. And so I wanted to thank them. Also wanted to thank Josh Wade for helping me get the show up in the gallery and actually helping me settle in when I first got here. He had to answer a lot of questions and show me around, and that was really helpful. And then I'd like to also thank Luke and Shijan and Ashed for helping me hang the show. Okay. And then one last thing, the Fulbright Canada is partially responsible for supporting this talk and the show and just me being here. All right, this talk is a little different than I'm used to giving, and I'm not sure whether it's actually an artist talk or a call to action or exactly what it is. And I kind of put it together at the beginning of August, late July and August, and then the Amazon caught on fire or began to burn, at least was much more obvious than it was before. And Hurricane Dorian leveled the Bahamas and then hit the Atlantic Canada provinces. And so, you know, this just demonstrates the urgency of what I'm going to be talking about, not my artwork, but the topic that I'm going to be talking about. So I'm going to talk about my work for the last 4 or 5 years, and prior to that I did primarily performance art for 3 years. This slide is an example of the kind of work I'm pretty much going to talk about today, and the show and piece was titled Extinguishing the Fire. My recent work comes out of a concern for the environment, like Natalie said, the fossil fuel dependence and a growing global crisis related to climate change. I'm not a climate scientist or an expert on the environment, so my talk focuses primarily on how I have addressed these issues in my artwork. My Fulbright project will explore some of the issues surrounding fossil fuel industry that connects Canada and the US. For this talk, I'm going to discuss how my artwork attempts to bring the issues of climate change and the environment down to a personal level. Issues related to climate change often are couched as too far off, too abstract, or not immediate enough for people to grasp. So, for the most part, I'm going to stay away from statistical information and doomsday scenarios and focus on the individual or personal impact of climate change. Also, I'm going to put off the good-bad binary for a little while, at least until later in the talk. My talk will be about my artwork, what it means to me, why it looks the way it does, and how I ended up working with this particular content and these materials. Okay. Well, I'm not even on my talk, am I? There we go. This is a quote from Richard Powers' book, The Overstory. If you haven't read it, I recommend it. It's great. Okay. Shifting Uncertainties is the title, kind of the general title I've given to this Fulbright project that I'm going to be working on. And like I said, this piece, which is the same piece that I showed you before, it was titled Extinguishing the Fire. And I'll be talking about work like this. But first, I'm going to go back in time a bit and provide a little personal history about when and where I grew up. I'm doing this because I think it will help you understand why I work with the content that I do and why the artwork looks the way it does. And when I was a kid, my family moved around a lot. My father worked for Xerox Corporation, and every few years we would move, and we'd end up in a new city or state. And this is me when I was about 9 years old. That's my first car, bike with a steering wheel. I was so excited to get that. You couldn't do this with it or you'd wreck, but that was it. Okay. On July 22nd, 1969, the Cuyahoga River in Cleveland, Ohio caught on fire when floating pieces of oil slick debris were ignited on the river by sparks caused by a passing train. At the time, the Cuyahoga River was one of the most polluted rivers in the United States. It wasn't the first time the river had caught on fire, and it was extinguished fairly rapidly. But it captured the public's attention. In 1969, the U.S. legislature passed the National Environmental Policy Act, which was signed into law on January 1st, 1970. This act helped establish the Environmental Protection Agency, which would be given the duties to manage the environmental risks and regulate various sanitary-specific policies. That was the year my family moved to Cleveland, Ohio from Richmond, Virginia, and I was 10 years old. In June of 1972, when I was 12 years old, my family moved from Cleveland, Ohio to Mechanicsburg, Pennsylvania, just across the river from Harrisburg, the capital. A few days later, torrential rains and floods caused by Hurricane Agnes rolled through Pennsylvania and other locations on the East Coast. Harrisburg and Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania were dramatically affected. Fortunately, our house was on a hill, so it didn't receive any damage, but my father's office was flooded, and he recruited my brother and I to go down and help clean up. So I grew up in the 1970s, essentially, 60s and 70s, but the 70s, I was in my teens. So these were the last years of the Vietnam War. We had the first Earth Day celebration in 1970. We had Earth shoes I had a pair of those. The oil crisis of 1973 caused by OPEC oil embargo made people think that we were going to run out of gas. So we had gas lines. I wasn't driving yet, but the speed limit was reduced to 55 miles an hour in the U.S. And Jimmy Carter put solar panels on the roof of the White House in 1979. The panels were removed in 1986 during the Reagan administration. And this is when the little signs, and I've seen them around here, started showing up above light switches in bathrooms and things that you were supposed to turn off the lights when you left the room. And it's really interesting because my generation does it. And I noticed that, not necessarily the school-aged, the college-age kids now, but I do notice a difference. And it was really ingrained into our heads. At least it was for me. Okay, in 1979, 3 Mile Island, a nuclear power plant in Dauphin County, Pennsylvania, just outside of Harrisburg, had a partial meltdown of its reactor number 2. It was the most significant accident in U.S. commercial nuclear power history. I was just completing my first year of college at a satellite campus of Penn State University in York, Pennsylvania. I would commute an hour to York every day and drive by the power plant, which was just on the other side of the highway, which was just on the other side of the river. I'll never forget the eerie feeling that seemed to pervade the air at the time when we weren't sure if we were going to have a mandatory evacuation of the area. Everything seemed to come to a standstill for about a week. Reactor number 2 is decommissioned, and reactor number 1 is supposed to be decommissioned this September, and I don't know whether it has been or not. Okay, so Tyler School of Art, this is where I went to school. This is a picture of it. But things were kind of, rocky at that time. And so things were a little uncertain, as my title refers to. I grew up in central Pennsylvania, not far from Bethlehem, where Bethlehem Steel was headquartered. There was a Bethlehem Steel mill near where I lived, and in the heyday, Bethlehem Steel produced steel for shipbuilding. During the World Wars, they were a major supplier for steel for the war efforts. And by the early 1980s, the steel industry was in steep decline in the U.S., and the mills, if operating, were greatly reduced. So while in college, I became fascinated by decaying steel industry around where I grew up, so I go out and sit in my car and do drawings on site. So this is actually one of the drawings from back then. I was interested in the idea of entropy that Robert Smithson talked about, and in the romantic idea that big, powerful symbols of human progress were in the end subject to death and decay, just like everything else. So most of my teachers discouraged representation of any kind at the time, especially working from photographs. So as a good student, I'd go out in the car and find a good parking spot and sit there in the cold and draw. I got chased away a few times by guards. Okay, and then in graduate school, I took an art history class, and I didn't have to take one. I love art history. I took more art history than I needed to. But I took an art history class, and it was an American art history class, and it was the first time this professor had ever taught it, and he was so fantastic. It was great. He would talk about 2 or 3 slides for the whole class period. It was amazing. But anyway, he introduced me sort of to the 19th century landscape painters of the Hudson River School. So painters like Thomas Cole and Albert Bierstadt and Frederick Church often expressed romantic ideas in their paintings. And these ideas were sort of, imported from Europe. This idea of a colonial gaze turned on the landscape with the idea that of looking at it as if it's a resource just waiting to be exploited sort of comes back in my work. And so that's kind of why I'm showing you these things. Okay. And so Church's painting of icebergs was completed in 1861 after a research trip to Newfoundland in 1859. where he studied the icebergs and made hundreds of drawings and sketches, whale sketches. And in the same year, Edwin Drake was hired by the Seneca Oil Company to look for oil in Pennsylvania around the area of Titusville, and found it. At the time, oil was primarily used to create kerosene for lamps. So at the time, these painters were looking at the landscape in the way that I described, and other ways. Oil was just being discovered in Pennsylvania. Okay, so that's some background. Now, coming up to a little closer to the present time, I wanted to talk a little bit, very briefly, about the performance work that I did prior to starting this body of work that I'm going to be showing you, because I think it's really important. Okay. So in 2010, 2012, I received New Direction Initiative grants from the Great Lakes College Association to explore performance art. These grants were made available for mid-career faculty to explore areas that were outside their primary area of focus, and I was trained as a painter. I spent the better part of 3 years doing only performance art before I returned to making objects. And sometime in 2014, I knew I wanted to make some large drawings, but I really was done with making work that needed to be stored and shipped and creating problems with large work that the large work creates. So one of the reasons I started doing performance in the first place was that I was tired of making stuff that cluttered up the world. So this is just one of the performances that I did. The performance work got me moving in a little bit more political direction in the work, and this one in particular. While I was making a short video, I started drawing on some of the plastic drop cloth material I had sitting around the studio. I loved the way that the material looked and the way it sounded when it moved. I began thinking about the fact that it was plastic and I probably shouldn't be using this stuff because it's so environmentally unfriendly. And then I started thinking about how lightweight it was, how it would be easy to ship and store if I would make work on it. So the dilemma became the dilemma of ease and convenience versus the problematic environmental issues the plastic posed became what the work would be about. I could work large and store it and ship the work easily, making it green in a sort of way. And the contradiction and message inherent in the materials was the content of the work. So the question became, how do we retreat from an industry that is enmeshed into every aspect of our existence and comprises the very foundation of our economies? So the first pieces in this body of work that I made were called monuments to the ephemeral. I really wanted to make images that were frozen in time, like monuments, that immortalized disappearing environmental features. They were meant to represent the dramatic speeding up of the pace of change that the climate crisis was causing. So this was the first show I had of this work, and you can see it was on the wall at the time. This is some of the same, not the same pieces, but the same body of work, and then these are sort of hung out. That's my studio at the time. From the beginning, I felt like that the work, working with the issues of climate change might be too pedantic in nature. So I wanted to include something that was personal, something that made them a little more elusive or mysterious. So I decided to introduce bits of love letters that I would write to people in my life. So each of these has some of them have like full-blown love letters that I would write. I would write the love letters during the process of making them, and some of them would just have 1 or 2 lines. They started out being love letters to friends and lovers from the past and present, and then to my sons and my parents. My rationale was that love was as fragile as the environment, and that it needed care and attention, good stewardship, or it would go wrong, deteriorate, and become spoiled. Sometimes the love letters related to the images, but the most successful ones didn't. Even though they were monumental and meant to be monuments, I also saw them as ephemeral because nature is ephemeral, and the images themselves were not made with archival materials, so they wouldn't last long, even though the plastic that the images were on was problematically long-lasting. As I said before, the plastic plays an important, if not problematic, role in the content. Without the plastic representing its usefulness, its beauty, and its ubiquitous role in our lives, the work would be just a bunch of pretty landscapes. The work itself is fairly fragile. The Sumi ink I used can be wiped off. Some of the pieces have holes in them. Some have patches that never really quite work, just like when we try to patch the environment. The work changes over time, fading, flaking, and the like. Also, the pieces move as you walk by them, suggesting the impact the impact on the environment by just our mere human presence. All of this is important to the work. I began hanging the work away from the walls so that the viewers had to walk through the landscapes. The pieces sway and are impacted by the slightest movements of our bodies. For this work, I stayed away from making images that explored the cause of climate change and tried to focus on imagery that explored the effects. Most of the early pieces were focused on water because when I think about climate change and environmental degradation, I think about air and water, whether it's floods, droughts, melting glaciers, or environmental accidents like oil pipeline leaks into rivers, release of methane or other chemicals into water systems because of fracking, tanker spills in the oceans, or rig explosions at sea like the Deepwater Horizon oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico in 2010. So some of the early pieces were more gestural or symbolic in nature. Here's a detail, this is a detail of the last piece where I scraped the words in, so the whole thing's covered with ink, and then I've scraped the text into it. And this is one of the earliest pieces, and it has lots of patches and holes in it. I was thinking of these as an extension of the performance work to some degree, so the early pieces are more physical. In fact, this was made just by dragging my hands down when the ink was on it, and then it comes off, the ink comes off. So there's a lot of physicality, there's patches and stuff in that. I like that. Okay, so in some of the early pieces I was consciously trying to make them reminiscent of the Hudson River School paintings. I wanted them to be seductive in the way that those paintings were. I wanted them to speak to a wide audience. And in some ways, to be a counter point to the Hudson River School paintings because they show the effects of the exploitation of the environment. And people did react positively to the work. Some just wanted to know how I made them. The environmental content resonated with others, and still others were drawn in by the love letters. I found that those under 30 were most responsive to the work. I think this is because they realized that my generation has left them to deal with the climate crisis. So as the work went along, the pieces started getting a lot darker and more tormented, and I made several pieces that came out all black, which I had to throw away. I was reading a book called by Dale Jamieson that some of you might know. It's called Reason in a Dark Time. I think it was influencing my mood, and at the time, and I also made. Let's see, I'm going the wrong way here. I also made two pieces that related to 3 Mile Island incident. So this one and that one. So you can see the stacks that are reflecting in the water. The text actually is about my roommate and friend from high school that I used to commute to campus with, and in our experience. And so it's a love letter to him, which he's never seen. Okay, so at the same time I was doing a different, another series of works. And in this series of works, I slowly began to introduce imagery related to environmental accidents in the fossil fuel industry. In a series of related silver points, I began to make these 2 by 2 inch drawings of industrial accidents. So the other pieces were really big, and then these are only this big. They're really small. I haven't worked on this series for about a year, but I plan to. They don't come across in slide because they're only this big, right? So that looks ridiculous. These images were meant to look like pastoral Dutch paintings of clouds, but upon closer examination you realize that they're anything but beautiful. They're explosions, and what look like clouds at first are actually billowing toxic balls of fire and black smoke. So this is another one, and again, it's only this big. That one's 2 by 4 inches. So they were the miniatures to contrast the large monumental pieces. The small scale was meant to represent how the environmental accidents were happening daily and going unnoticed by the general public unless they immediately affected you. These accidents typically go unreported in the mainstream media, or quickly vanish. There was just one in Illinois the other day, yesterday I think, and there wasn't much coverage on it at all. So I made a few pieces, oh wait a minute, let me go back here. Okay, so my partner, poet, and distinguished professor of creative writing at Iowa State University, and now poet laureate of Iowa, was doing research, and she just keeps getting stuff, was doing research and writing about fracking industry in her home state of North Dakota, and she was making trips to North Dakota and teaching writing workshops all through the state, supported by a North Dakota Council for the Humanities grant. And so this is when the fracking started showing up in my work. We started working on things kind of together. So I did a few pieces that were depicting pump jacks and flares. This was in my old studio. That's in our little gallery at the college. So I had a few little pieces like that. And then in 2016, Deb and I did residencies at the Virginia Center for the Creative Arts site in Auvillard, France. So this is me working in the studio there. And that's when the work started getting really big. We did a 3-week residency during that, and during that time I made a 12 by 60 foot drawing titled Something Gained, Something Lost. The piece was conceived of as a kind of scroll that depicted the process and issues related to fracking. And all the French were quick to tell me that fracking was illegal in France. But this was what loomed over the idyllic landscape of Auvillard. So that's from the residency site, and that's a gigantic nuclear power plant. I mean, so much bigger than 3 Mile Island. Couldn't believe it. So these are some shots of the piece back in my studio. See, the thing about this is it's a 60-foot drawing, and I folded it up to a 12-foot square and put it in my backpack and brought it home on the plane. So there are some, real benefits to working with this material, but it's plastic, right? So anyway, so you can see it's really big, and then it depends on what the space is like, how the thing, how I hang it, and then of course if there's air in the space, that really can change. I kind of allow the pieces to find their own form. Okay. So, the residency in France was the first residency I'd done since 2002, some 15 years while I was raising my kids. I forgot how productive they could be, so I did another one in the fall of 2017. I ended up going to the Virginia Center for the Creative Arts in Amherst, Virginia this time. That's their main site. I had a plan to do another fracking project, but on the drive down to Virginia from Michigan, I began to understand that I would be in coal country. And by the time I reached Virginia, I decided to research and produce a piece about mountaintop removal mining and the coal industry. And for this one, I basically broke the process down into its essential components and went at it from left to right. And by the end of 5 weeks, the drawing was 100 feet long, and I was finished. I don't have great photos of this piece because I've never really been able to show it anywhere because it's too big. And so this is actually in the barn at the Virginia Center for the Creative Arts. They have a big barn, pretty nice barn, a nice floor and things. So they let me hang it there to shoot it and show people what I was up to. And then these are shots from my studio. This gives you an idea of how I work on things. I work on them bits at a time, right? And so these are the first sections I did. And it sort of describes the process of blasting the rock away from the coal and all of that. And it's kind of a similar process that goes on in sort of the mining in the oil sands, actually. And much of the same equipment is used, or similar equipment is used. But one of the things I really liked about this piece was, or this part of it anyways, that part on the right side there, it's when I started doing it, I was like, man, this is just like those Monet poplar paintings. And so I don't know if you see the connection, but when I was doing it, I was thinking, wow, this looks just like those. Anyway, I couldn't find one that was just like those. But, okay. And then this, you can see these again. There's similar machines up in the oil sands. But this is called a drag line, and it's like the bucket on the end of that thing is it's probably the size of this room, you know, or at least half the size of this room, and it scrapes out the coal. And I wanted that thing to look like it was kind of on the edge of the world. And then these are the terraces that are created when they mine the coal, and these are roads. Some of these are roads that they drive along, right? And it's gigantic trucks, dump trucks. And so here's the piece kind of in the space. Can't really see the whole thing, but that's all right. I kind of like it that way. And then this is actually to show you, well, there's another slide. This is an ash pond. And it's the equivalent of the tailings ponds that are up in the oil sands, because it's burnt coal mixed with water, and then they just impound these things. Okay, and data collected by the U.S. Federal Environmental Protection Agency found that 95% of these things leak, seeping into rivers and groundwater supplies. Okay, so now we're sort of back to that first piece that I showed you, and I'm going to kind of bring in this sort of good, bad, binary bit in it, a little bit more here. Extinguishing the Fire looks less at the effects of climate change and more at the causes. The installation explores 3 turpitudes where humans have failed to behave. Where humans have failed to behave as good stewards of the planet. We knowingly contribute to the degradation of the environment and do little to curtail the desires or impulses that significantly contribute to the global climate change crisis. Extinguishing the Fire focuses primarily on the oil and gas industry's desire for profit and the impact fossil fuel extraction and consumption has upon the natural environment. The structure of Extinguishing the Fire is loosely based on Dante's 3 levels of sin. In Dante's Inferno, 3 major divisions of hell are identified: incontinence, violence, and fraud. The 3 types of sin take one lower into the depths of hell, with fraud being the most egregious of the offenses. Incontinence is defined by Dante as a lack of self-restraint, moderation, or self-control. Violence is a more grave category of sin, with offenses against oneself or one's own property, such as suicide and squander, as more severe than violence against other people or their property. Sins defined as fraud include actions taken by panderers, seducers, flatterers, hypocrites, thieves, false counselors, counterfeiters, and falsifiers in descending order of depravity. Extinguishing the Fire also is divided into 3 sections. The first section, with the text in continents, primarily depicts flaring of natural gas in the process of exploration, oil exploration, extraction, and refining. In the Balkan region of North Dakota, drilling companies vent or flare the natural gas that is a byproduct of fracking rather than invest the time and capital into the infrastructure to capture it. Flaring the gas is simply more cost-effective than capturing it. Burning off uncaptured gas, in addition to simply venting it, releases pollutants in the greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide, sulfur dioxide, and methane into the atmosphere. Nigeria is one of the world's top gas flaring nations. Petroleum companies have a notorious history of creating hazardous environmental conditions in the Niger Delta region from gas flaring, which despite a 2008 moratorium continues today. Burning of natural gas in close proximity to wildlife or inhabited areas, in addition to causing acid rain, raises other environmental and human health concerns. The fate of our planet is in the hands of those who put wasteful short-term gains ahead of sustainable future because of the lack of self-restraint, self-control, or what Dante calls incontinence. The section of the drawing with the text "violence" represents oil extraction, transportation, and refinery accidents. Most of these accidents are caused by human error, and they involve unsafe behavior or unsafe conditions, or a combination of both, as well as equipment failure. Regardless of the cause, there can be no doubt that these accidents result in violence against others and their property as defined by Dante. As dramatic as events like oil tanker derailments, refinery accidents, or oil pipeline spills and oil rig explosions are, the damage they cause pales in comparison to the more global harm caused by burning and consuming fossil fuels. Global warming caused by emissions from burning fossil fuels is the most serious and irreversible consequence of our dependence on oil, gas, and coal. Transportation emissions represents the largest single source of toxic air pollution in the U.S. Emissions contributes to acid rain and the formation of harmful particulate matter. In my mind, governments and the fossil fuel industry are responsible for perpetuating and capitalizing on the economic bonanza provided by recent developments in fracking and other extraction technologies in the long term, at the long-term expense of the natural environment, economy, and human health. Dante's definition of fraud identifies hypocrites, thieves, false counselors, counterfeiters, and falsifiers as the most severe of sinners. So, Bill McKibben defined the problem in his November 2018 New Yorker article like this, and this is a quote. Alex Steffen, an environmental writer, coined the term predatory delay to describe the blocking and slowing of needed change in order to make money off of unsustainable, unjust systems in the meantime. The behavior of the oil companies have pulled off perhaps the most consequential deception in mankind's history is a prime example. That's the end of the quote. I believe fossil fuel industry's actions fit firmly into Dante's definition of sins of fraud. The final section of Extinguishing the Fire addresses the effects of global warming. The World Meteorological Organization has determined that the last 4 years have been the warmest on record. The effects of warmer temperatures, lower precipitation rate, and lower soil moistures are contributing to woodland fires, making them much more susceptible to wildfires. So when I wrote this part of it, the Amazon wasn't on fire as far as I knew. And so, we had the Camp Fire fire in 2018 in California, There were 4 wildfires going on in Canada at the time. And of course, you had the Fort McMurray fire in 2016. So I mean, we're all just sort of surrounded. There was smoke. We could see smoke in Michigan from the Canada wildfires, and it was really weird. I mean, it looked kind of overcast, but it really wasn't. It was strange. So anyway, I don't have to tell you about that. But this section is meant to generally address one of the very tangible, real effects that greenhouse gas emissions has on the environment. Okay. And then Extinguishing the Fire examines the failings of our human nature and the fragility of the natural environment. The scale of the work is meant to be all-encompassing, a world unto itself, a reminder of the all-pervasive effect that climate change has already had upon the environment and our lives. Okay, so I'm just going to say a few things about the show that's actually in the gallery right now. So this is my house. The house sits on the lands of the Potawatomi. And there's a lot of problems with this picture, or this image. And I'm not going to go into all that, but you got the monoculture here, you got the 2-car garage, you got it's in suburbia. I mean, there's 300 houses in my neighborhood that look just like this. You know, what do you got to do to keep the lawn looking like? Well, I don't do much, but it just happened to be a nice day. So there's lots of problems, but that's not why I'm showing you this. And I bought the house in 2007, and 7 months later, in 2008, in June of 2008, we had a 100-year flash flood. Then in September 2008, we had approximately 12 inches of rain over a 5-day period from the remnants of Hurricane Ike moving in from the south. Both events caused my finished basement to flood, eventually costing me over $20,000 in cleanup and repairs to my house so that the similar rain events wouldn't affect the property in the future. I had landscaping done, put perimeter drains in, sump pumps in the basement. I had inverters put in, backup batteries installed, repaired the drywall that had to be ripped out when the drains were put in. I bought a portable generator, then I had the house wired so I could use the portable generator, and finally I bought a standby generator to power the house in case I wasn't there and we had a rain event and the power went out. That's the direct economic effect weather events have had on me personally. I know it sounds overly dramatic, but I also ended up with PTSD, believe it or not, which caused continuous benign muscle fasciculations all over my body for 3 months. It wasn't until I saw a neurologist and was told that I didn't have ALS, which my father had died from 3 years previously, that the twitches began to subside. This is just a picture of the 2008 flood downtown in Kalamazoo. And these are pictures, so this is what's in the gallery. These are pictures from my current studio. It's about the same, I have about the same working space as I had in my other one. I was sharing the other one. With these pieces, I wanted to bring the work back to something more personal. So for the flood piece, the flood pieces, I decided to include text that related to that when my house flooded in 2008 and the response I had. After the muscle twitches began to decrease, I'd still have dreams about my house flooding. So the lightness of the piece is meant to represent the idea of memory. Also, the house in the left section here is a sort of double image that I intended to represent memory, or how the past creeps into the present and future. The rest of the piece shows different effects of climate change-induced flooding, whether because of storms at sea or on the right, or torrential rains in the Midwest. They're a little pixelated. The scroll-like format makes a reappearance in this piece so that you can read it in a temporal way. I like how the piece represents the idea of past, present, and future. So with the tornado pieces, and again, these are just shots from my studio after I finished the pieces. I haven't shot this show yet. I wanted to say something about the denial of climate change or about complacency. It's kind of amazing how many articles and reports, books, and movies are out there about climate change, and the scenarios are terrifying. And yet we still aren't making the kind of progress we need in order to deal with the issues in a significant way. The tornado pieces are titled "Wait and See" and "A Uniquely American Experience." I was trying to get at the denial of what is clearly happening all around us. I wanted to make pieces that were somewhat banal in many ways, that would seem unexceptional except for the impending doom. A uniquely American experience is meant to reference Americans' particular inertia and stubborn denial of climate change and the resistance to do anything about it. The title also refers to the fact that tornadoes take place in North America more than any place else in the world. And then finally, just a few words about what I'm doing here. So by now, it's probably obvious why I applied to do a Fulbright project at the University of Alberta. As I was thinking about my next project, I began to focus on the 2010 Kalamazoo River oil spill that resulted in one of the largest inland oil spills in U.S. history. In 2010, Enbridge Pipe 6B broke and oil was released into the Talmadge Creek and Kalamazoo River. To make a very long story short, on on July 25th, people began reporting a strong smell of gas or gas-like substance in the area of Marshall, Michigan. Firefighters were sent out to assess the situation, and the firefighters said that they smelled something that was like gas, but it smelled more like crude. Line 6B is just one section of a pipeline connecting the Enbridge system to the Lakehead system that stretches from North Dakota to the refineries that go around the Great Lakes. The system originates in the Alberta tar sands. Shortly after the break was confirmed, Enbridge estimated that 819,000 gallons of crude had already made its way downstream to the Kalamazoo River. And the creek cleanup continued until 2014. They made them keep going back. Another Enbridge pipeline, Line 5, which runs under the Straits of Mackinac, so that's right here, right there. The 66-year-old pipeline carries 23 million gallons daily of synthetic crude from the oil sands in northern Alberta. The line splits into two separate lines 250 feet below the surface of the water that runs between Lake Huron and Lake Michigan. The strength and multi-directional nature of the current in the straits has caused erosion of the lake bed underneath the pipes, making them less secure. A line break in the Straits of Mackinac would send oil into both Lakes Michigan and Huron. The pipeline has not had an accident in the Straits of Mackinac yet, but concerns include the age and condition of the pipes, the volume and the pressure of the fluids. Enbridge has installed several support structures under the pipes in 2006 and 2010. These two pipeline issues got me thinking about the fossil fuel connection between Canada and the U.S. Oil and natural gas run through arteries connecting Canada and the U.S. Pipelines and rail cars carry the crude that is the foundation of our economies. The United States and Canada's energy interests are inextricably intertwined. According to the U.S. Energy Information Administration, in 2017, the U.S. received approximately 40% of its imported petroleum products from Canada, a larger percentage than from any other country by far. The final outcome of my project will be some kind of large art installation that explores climate change and some of the complex issues surrounding fossil fuel dependence connecting the two countries. I believe that art can create an arena where difficult subjects are given time and space for contemplation and reflection. How we transition to a new model of safer, sustainable energy consumption is going to take great imagination, sacrifice, and effort. It won't be easy, but we have to start by getting everyone to agree on the problems and to create the will to seek solutions. So with that, I will take questions if anybody has any.